There were many things that led to America as we know it today, and we have a pretty basic timeline of what events happened in order to get to the place that we are today. There are many events that occurred that ended up impacting our Constitution in the way that it is, and for the most part, is quite successful. This will go over what those events were and how they did impact the Constitution. Starting off, we have the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was a war that took place from 1754 to 1763 between the French and the British. The French wanted to control the Ohio River Valley as it was good for their trade, and the British just wanted to continue to grow. Oh, at the end of the war, the British eventually did win, but they ended up having a increased amount of debt. Because of this, they had to raise their taxes on the colonies, which brings us into our next topic. Our next topic is taxes. There were a couple different acts made in place in order to help recuperate the money that they lost during the French and Indian War, which was technically for the protection of the 13 colonies and to expand themselves. The first act that took place was the Sugar Act, which lowered the tax on imported molasses in hopes that it would stop the colonies from continuing to smuggle. The more important part of this was that it let officers seize any smuggled items, any items that you had on your boat and your boat itself if you were caught smuggling without needing to go to court. Colonists thought that this was taking away their right as a colony, and they fought back against it, and it was eventually repealed. The next act was the Stamp Act, which was a tax on all printed materials. So it was a stamp, and if you didn't have the stamp, you weren't paying the tax. The colonists continued to hate it because they didn't like being taxed without their consent. The whole reason that the colonies didn't like the taxes was because they didn't have any say in it, which we can see in our Constitution, as we have choices as to who we elect and what they do to represent ourselves. So they hated the Stamp Act and protested and boycotted the British's important items, causing the people who were selling those items to beg Britain to repeal the act, which it eventually was in March 1766. More importantly, Great Britain didn't care about what the colonies were saying about how they were requesting to have a say, no taxation without representation, and said that they could always tax them, the colonies, no matter what. They didn't have a say in it, which obviously made the colonies quite angry. The next act was the Townshend Act, which increased the tax on imported goods. So everything, a little bit of everything. Maybe maybe they were thinking that instead of paying taxes on specific items, it was a tiny tax on everything, but it was still a tax, which is what the colonies didn't like. They didn't like that they had to pay taxes. It was like they were being taxed without any representation on their own part. So they hate it and continue to boycott it. They also made groups to recoup whatever supplies they weren't getting from Britain. They also burnt down British officials' houses as a sign of protest. Definitely getting your point across. Eventually, because of all of this unrest, it did lead to the Boston Massacre. Moving on to the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre was a killing of civilians in the street in Boston. It took place on March 5th, 1770, where a mob of civilian colonists were pelting British officers with clubs and snowballs made of ice and other assorted items, begging them to shoot them, which eventually, in self-defense, they did. None of the soldiers were found guilty of murder, but 8 people were injured and 3 killed. 2 of the 8 injured were actually murdered, making it 5. A sad death. This was used as propaganda by the group Sons of Liberty, the colonist group the Sons of Liberty, which were aiming to fight against the British and their rule. The Boston Massacre, which wasn't portrayed as how it was. Instead, it was an orderly mob being shot at by bloodthirsty redcoats, British soldiers. Because of how they didn't have an easy way to transfer information that time, there was a painting, as shown, of what it looked like. And if you were a colonist, that's what you would have seen, which helped sway others into believing what had happened, which wasn't entirely true. After the Boston Massacre, the British passed another act, the Tea Act. This made it so that the West Indian Tea Company had a monopoly over tea. The colonies did not like it and said that you can't port and unload here, which they did anyways. This caused the previously mentioned Sons of Liberty group to raid one of the ships and dump thousands of dollars of tea into the harbor, ruining all of it. This really made the British angry. They then passed the Intolerable Acts, which really put a lockdown on everything that you could do in Boston. They closed the harbor and stopped you from pretty much doing anything. Soldiers could shelter in your home without you having any say as to what they could or could not do, and they really hammered down on Boston, which, as you could tell, obviously really annoyed the colonists even more than they already were angry with the British. Because of all the anger from the colonies of the British exerting their authority, which wasn't uncalled for, they were colonies of the British, they created a Congress which was meant to show the American interest. At this meeting that they had with this Congress of sorts, they decided that they were going to continue to boycott the British and asked for the acts that they had placed the British to be repealed, such as the Intolerable Act, as well as telling their people that they should arm themselves and form militias in case they need to fight against the British. The British didn't like how they were forming these militias, so they sent a lot of soldiers over to stop them. The colonists didn't quite stop them, but slowed them down just enough that their stockpiles of weapons weren't able to be seized by the British. And so, when they did exchange fire at Lexington and Concord, kind of started the war between the British and the colonies, and was also known as because of this, the famous speech "Shot Heard Round the World" was spoken. After that, the Continental Congress meeting was held, as the king had rejected their Declaration of Rights, and as well as the fighting at Lexington and Concord, and them trying to seize their weapons, which is in our Second Amendment connection. They made an official army, started printing money. They started printing money and made one last petition, the Olive Branch Petition, which was like, leave us alone. We're going to become our own separate country, and like, can we have peace? Which the king did not like and denied it. So many people decided that we're already fighting with the British, and we've already fought with them before, and they're already fighting against us. So we should cut all of our ties and declare ourselves independent from the British. So they did. They made the Declaration of Independence and declared themselves our own country, which the 13 colonies then became 13 states. And this concludes our timeline of sorts.